huge amount of time to Terry and do this video, but I did want to do this video before I left. Fox News, working at a radio station, newsman, and as a newsman working at a radio station and doing the news every morning, I get the opportunity to have multiple televisions on as you walk through and exist in the station. I mean, you have Fox, you have CNN, you have MSNBC, I think you have RT, etc. And you get to see kind of the flavor of what each of the networks are talking about. You kind of float above it all because you're trying to be an honest actor and just kind of give, your explanation of the world and everything else. All right. CNN, they're talking about the building collapse. Okay, basically 120 something people are going to end up dead. They don't want to necessarily say that yet. They're trying to get people associated and accustomed to the feeling of all of these people dying and until etc. But basically a tomb that used to be a building, and who did it, who was responsible, etc., etc. That's CNN. MSNBC is talking about Joe Biden, something about the president, maybe floats onto the building, etc. RT again is talking about something pertinent in the world, and Fox News is talking about critical race theory. This is their new thing. Critical race theory is this kind of analysis of, let's say, our structures of our society that makes our society what our society is, especially in the way that it propagates an idea of whiteness, blackness, and how those things function in society. This notion of white privilege and those type of things. And how do you communicate that to a child in a way where that child doesn't basically grow up racist? Now, in theory, it sounds like a yes. It has to be a yes. Why wouldn't you explain your world to your child or to your people who are growing up in your society, as opposed to having, I remember having history books where slaves were lounging on a slave boat, just arm behind head, just chilling. Think about that. I mean, that's astonishing, right? Meaning, history is going to be taught from a perspective. What do you want the perspective to be? And do you want it to be a perspective that instantiates and perpetuates this kind of I don't know, the system, the way the system perpetuates itself pertaining to race. Now, I have qualms with this because I'm wondering whether this is more economic. If you took, let's say, white kids, indigenous kids, all of these, races of the world, you put them on a ship and you sent them somewhere, and all of the people in that society had to basically pull together in order to make that society work. Will you have racism in that society? And the answer is probably no. You don't have the economic triggers. You don't have this kind of history of racism and everything else that was there. The society is fundamentally different. You've had a break in history, a stop in time. And so it's like, okay, well, if you can eliminate it there, is it an economic issue? I think it's a lot of stuff. It's history sticking to itself. It's economics. All that stuff instantiates itself that allows the system to perpetuate itself. What's the use in trying to get people to not be racist if you have a racial gap in regards to wealth, where whites have like 160,000 worth and blacks have $18,000? But he's not racist. Great. He's not racist. And yet, the person has the indignity of not being able to keep their lights on. No, there's more to it, I think, than just trying to get kids to not necessarily be racist. The system itself, I think, perpetuates itself. And you may try to get kids to not be a particular way, but you have to deal with the economic factors for those kids to feel some kind of way about themselves. And that goes beyond just them being or not being racist. That said, I see nothing wrong with teaching it. How you teach it, whether it's in theory versus whether it's in practice, and I think that's where the issue comes in. How does it look? Now, Fox News has seized upon this as being the most important thing ever, or at the very least the most important thing in the moment. And so if you do a casual glance, you would have to inevitably see somebody talking about critical race theory in somewhat of a critical way. You can always find examples that it went wrong. Like I said, it's one thing to talk about it in theory, it's another thing for it in practice, and you can see it in some cases in practice that might go wrong. It's another thing, though, to use that as a misdirect, which is what they're doing. Meaning, it's one thing to have a conversation about critical race theory and how it's taught and whether it be taught and all that other stuff. It's another thing to take a news platform as a mouthpiece of the Republican Party, and with all of the issues available to you at your disposal, all of the problems that avail you, your society, the members of your constituencies, and to turn that platform and say, all interests and all powers need to be devoted to this one specific offbeat issue. It's a misdirect. The entire point of this conversation is to create and inflame a culture war. That's the only reason you would do it. Donald Trump, who the Republican Party has basically turned around and given fealty and allegiance to, is their top gorilla. This is their King Kong. This is the Godzilla that's rattling the cage, ready to get out and do battle. That's this various speeches and everything else. It's culture war politics. And honestly, at a certain point, people should feel and expect more from their politicians. And this is not a Democrat-Republican thing. This is more of a, what are the problems that avail your society? For fuck's sake, 600,000 people have dropped dead. And they dropped dead as a result of government malfeasance. And whether that's Trump was in or Obama was in, I think they would have did better if they were Democrats, because they tend to be more technocratic on that stuff. But that's besides the point, that it was a governmental failure. And this was one of those things where it's like, how do you end up with 600,000 people dead, 30 million people infected with a virus in a country that does not have universal health care, and you have all of these people with health care bills, 30 million people, give or take, and you're arguing about children's books, or you're choosing to make your focus critical race theory. There's something wrong with your party at that point. You are fighting to prevent people from getting $15 an hour. That's both political parties. Both political parties think America is not worth $15 an hour, despite the fact that Biden was calling it a starvation wage. I mean, it's appalling that you depend on these various people during the point of the pandemic, and then after the pandemic, you toss them overboard. Both parties. I'm making the point that if your party is talking about critical race theory, and you got 30 million people that were infected with the virus, 600,000 that have dropped dead over the course of the year, more than over the course of the past wars, and you're telling me that that's the lens, that's the thing that we need to devote all attention to at this moment. It is utter nonsense. It is nonsense. What about your wages? What about your wages? How much all of these people who they can't find jobs for? Why? Because those people said, for the first time, whew, I got breathing room because I've been living hand to mouth in a job that was a subsistence wage. And now they're complaining because they can't find people to work at a subsistence hand to mouth wage. The issue here is not that you can't find people to work there, it's that you can't find people to work at that wage. If people paid higher, you would get those people to get jobs. Now, is that an issue? Yes. Who is that an issue for? That's an issue for the companies not paying more. Fox News' issue is critical race theory. That's the issue. That's the issue. I'm making the point that even in Republican circles, what are the things that avail you? And even as Republicans, what about wages? What about jobs? What about ensuring you have health care going forward, whether that's a public option? I mean, for God's sake, even the majority of Republicans agree with Medicare for all. Critical race theory. Critical race theory. Hey, what about expanding Social Security? Again, something Republicans agree with. Critical race theory. That's what we need to talk about. Hey, what about automation and the way that automation is going to be taking jobs going forward in the future? Oh, critical race theory, right? We need to talk about that. I'm making a point that there are heavier, weightier issues that are availing your particular society, and it seems that the thing that Republicans want to talk about is culture war issues. You talk about culture war issues when you don't have anything else to talk about. When issues of economics, when issues of all this stuff, when you lose those arguments, you need to talk about something else. Hey, let's talk about economics. No, I want to talk about the culture war stuff. Hey, let's talk about automation. I want to talk about culture war stuff. We don't want to talk about anything that means anything where we would have to actually do anything that's actionable if we even win the goddamn argument. So instead, we want to talk about culture war stuff. We think we can win the culture war stuff argument because we don't have to add anything to the culture war thing. Meaning we don't have to do anything for our constituents under these guidelines. It's pathetic. 600,000 Americans die, and you don't give a shit about your population, or for that matter, your viewing constituency. What you care about are the people who are putting dollars in your pocket, or for that matter, your political party. You are informing your audience when you're making a choice. Meaning you're saying, I want to choose this and cover this over that. And in this very specific case, the Republican Party is basically putting out their mouthpiece, Fox News. And their mouthpiece, Fox News, has chosen this thing as their sticking point to fight on. And the fact that they chose something like this gets across that they don't believe they can win any of the other arguments. And not just that, going to culture war, like I said before, is somewhat of a nod of economics. Nope, not going to deal with that. We're not going to deal with anything of worth and value where you would have any expectations of us to do anything actionable. No. We want to fight on an issue where we don't have to do anything but not do. Meaning, we need to stop X from taking place. But the moment that we get in office, we're going to put through our own economic policies and everything else that has nothing to do with critical race theory, even though critical race theory was the thing that we talked about the most. It's sneaky, disgusting politics. And it's the politics of basically misdirection. And I'm saying it's misdirection at this magician level. You're giving things to your audience framed in a particular way that you know your audience of people are going to absorb in a particular way. Does it have to be honest? Nope. In fact, it's almost on some level better. Whether it's honest or not is almost irrelevant. Oftentimes, what they give in are bombastic antidotes or antidotes that don't necessarily, or is not necessarily indicative of reality. It's just there in order to push a conversation in a particular direction. It is overt and over the top and out of alignment with anything that's reality. In fact, the entire point of them doing it is to create a media narrative of it, meaning they're creating a story that wasn't really there in the first place. Like, share,